there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology. Welcome back to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast about language teaching and applied linguistics. In this episode, we bring you an interview with Professor Anne Burns. Anne Burns is a professor of language education at Aston University and honorary professor at the University of Sydney. Professor Burns' main research interests are action research and reflective practice, and her recent publications include Teaching Speaking, a Holistic Approach, the Cambridge Guide to Pedagogy and Practice in Second Language Teaching, and Doing Action Research in English Language Teaching, a guide for practitioners. Matt spoke to Professor Burns back in November 2016 at Soka University, where she was teaching a short teacher education program, and asked her some questions about the importance of action research for teachers. We hope you enjoy the interview.
Okay, so I'm joined today by Professor Anne Burns. We're here in Soka University, which is just on the outskirts of Tokyo, on an autumn Tuesday. And thank you very much for joining me today. I know you've been teaching today. But, yeah.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being here. Perhaps we'll start. Could you briefly tell us about your career to date, and in particular how you came to be interested in the area of action research?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of interesting story and a bit of a personal story, really, because I started off as a teacher of French, actually, long time ago, and emigrated eventually to Australia. And when I got to Australia, I started working in the Australian Adult Migrant English Program, which is a program funded by the Australian government for refugees and immigrants coming into the country. Right. And I was very fortunate to arrive in that program at a time when there was a lot of creativity around amongst teachers. We weren't working to lots of set or prescriptive syllabuses or curriculum. We could, spend our time identifying our own activities in the classroom and developing lots of professional development together, which helped us to think of quite interesting activities for those particular groups of students. And then eventually I moved to a research centre, which was at Macquarie University in Sydney, and was working in the centre there, funded by the government for the Adult Migrant Programme. Right. And it was very interesting, actually, because we needed to create a sort of model of different research approaches that could be used with different people who were involved in that program. And one of my colleagues at the time, Jeff Brindley, wrote a very interesting paper talking about 3 types of research that would be suitable for the kind of work we were doing. So one was the usual sort of blue sky or discovery research, theoretical research, which could be developed in relation to teaching adult immigrants and refugees. Yeah. And then the other was more like applied research. So what kind of research could be applied in the classroom, both theoretically and practically. But the third kind of research he talked about was practitioner research. And that meant, being available to, or making ourselves accessible to working with teachers right across the program and right across Australia, actually, who wanted to be involved. And in fact, when we first started going out to meet teachers, they did say things like, well, you guys work in the ivory tower of the university. What do you know about our lives in classrooms? And so we were really challenged, I guess, to think about how could we work productively with teachers and involve them in doing research with us. And at the time, David Noonan was also working in that centre and had done quite a bit on promoting action research for teachers. So I became very, very interested in the concept of practitioner research that could be applied to your own classroom, and did quite a number of projects at that time with teachers across the country. And the interesting thing was that often the teachers were informing us at the research centre about what kind of pressures or challenges or major areas were important in their classrooms. So it was a very interesting way of working with teachers across the whole country and bringing them actively into the research that we were doing. So that's really where I got interested in the idea of action research and started to think myself about, developing some ways of working with a number of teachers across a very large country where they could be involved.
Yeah, and you've written a number of books on action research and kind of showing us how to go about start to finish, I guess, the cycle of action research. I wonder if you could tell our listeners some of the moments of action research that you talk about.
Yeah, well, it's not really my term. It's Chemist and McTaggart's.
Right, sure.
So Chemist and McTaggart worked a lot in the Australian context using action research in schooling. And they talk about a cycle of research, and this is the one that we used and adapted in our own professional development program. So what they mention is that, first of all, we need to act in some way, or plan, first of all. So it's plan, act, observe, reflect. Those are the 4 stages in the cycle. And planning is really reflecting on and thinking about and identifying issues that you think are going to be of interest or importance, or which are a curiosity or a dilemma or a challenge in your teaching that you'd like to understand more about or to change in some way. Right. And then the next part of it, the act part, would be to do with developing some plan of action to put something into place in the classroom that you're going to try out rather differently. And then to see what happens. And the observe is really to do with systematically collecting information or data so that you've got some evidence to show what's happening as a result of your changes.
Right.
And reflection. It's interesting, they put reflect last in the cycle, but my own view is that really reflection permeates the whole cycle. So from the moment you begin, you're really reflecting on what's happening, reflecting on the plans that you have, and identifying things that you can do as part of this cycle. So it's an interesting model. It's quite simple in some ways, but I like it because I think it creates a sort of a framework for teachers to think about how they can go about doing research, and gives them some guidance through the whole process.
Yeah. And can you give an example of an individual success story where a teacher took that model and ran with it and had some success?
Oh, where do I start? Because I've worked with so many teachers now, particularly in Australia, and both in the adult migrant program, but also more recently I've been working with teachers in the international student sector in Australia. Okay. And there are lots of interesting examples about how teachers have changed their ideas, their practice. Trying to think of a particular example. I suppose a fairly dramatic one was when I worked with a teacher in the adult migrant program, and she was working with refugees who had just come in from ex-Yugoslavia. Okay. And she wanted to help them be more, to speak more in the classroom. And when she started off with that particular group of students, she couldn't understand why the dynamics in the classroom were so poor and why she was not getting much response from the students. And she was a very experienced teacher, and she was asking the students very the usual kind of questions that you might ask in a class like that, which was, to do with families and friends and their stories before they came to the country. And in fact, the more she asked those kinds of questions, the worse the situation in the classroom got. Right. And of course, she realised that not very long before that, the different groups in her classroom had been at war with each other, fighting each other. Of course, they were very reluctant to say anything that was personal about each other. Yeah. So once she realised that through her action research cycle and started talking to them, interviewing them, talking to others who had worked with similar students, she began to realise that, in fact, she had to really change her teaching. So she said she became the most uncommunicative teacher that she knew, rather than the most communicative. Right. changed the whole way in which she taught the class.
Yeah. And that's one of the things you mentioned about action research. The journey is flexible, and questions that you had at the beginning may be different to questions that you had at the end.
Yes, and I think that's quite a good example of, having a certain kind of focus to start with. And in fact, it was only when she started looking much more deeply into what was happening for those students in her classroom that she really got a sense of much deeper issues underlying the behaviour that was going on. So it's certainly, I think, once people begin the action research process, as one teacher said to me, often you end up asking more questions than you answer, because more and more new things keep coming up for you.
And sticking with the idea of the individual researcher, in your 2009 book, Doing Action Research in English Language Teaching, throughout the book you have individual voices of researchers. How important a factor do you think it is that the individual educator in the process of AR as a factor of the study in itself?
Yes, well, I mean, action research is often accused of being rather thin or unreliable research, because it often is seen as quite subjective, because it's working individual people or pairs of people sometimes working in their own context with their own issues. But in fact, this kind of research does give lots of insights into what's happening in different classrooms and what individual teachers are interested in. So although you may be working alone, you're still finding out a lot more that can change your professional practice and create a much deeper or better understanding of what works in your classroom. Actually, I'm not so keen on the idea of the individual action research. I know that sometimes teachers don't have the opportunity to work with other colleagues, possibly because they're not in an environment where people are interested in collaborating, or they don't have the opportunity to work together. But really, most of my approach is really that people should work together if at all possible, because then they can really get ideas from each other. I tend to work with groups of teachers who come together and share their ideas about the issues that they want to look at in the classroom, and then as the research goes on, they can really get lots of input from each other about different techniques or strategies that could be used, and also they can help each other to sort of analyse or refine what they see coming from the data that they're collecting. So it's a very, very positive and collaborative way for people to work together, I think.
And how has that sense of collaboration changed? I remember in your 1999 book, Collaborative Action Research for Language Teachers, you talked about the need for, I guess, having a teacher network, whether it be like a local one in your institution or a slightly more wider one perhaps. How has the internet kind of changed that teachers network? Or
well, it's quite exciting, I think, and the most recent project that I've been involved in is one which was supported by the British Council, and that was one where I really didn't quite know how it was going to work out. I worked with a colleague from Aston University in the UK, Dr. Noor Hutoglu-Hooten, and what we did was we decided that we would try to create a sort of community of practice through technology, with different teachers from across different countries coming together to work collaboratively on action research. And one of the themes that the British Council or priorities that the British Council had identified when they put out a call for proposals was using technology in the classroom. So we decided that we would try to encourage teachers to work with us to look at how they could do action research on technology use in the classroom. And we ourselves at the same time were using technology to bring the teachers together. So it was a very, I think without modern technology we probably couldn't have done that so easily. Noor was in the UK and I was in Australia, and we had teachers who were collaborating with us from 9 different countries, spread out from Spain over to Japan, and we had to sort of identify, how we could get these teachers together with such different time zones and such different locations and contexts. So what we did was we split up the teachers who were interested into 2 groups, and we had ones who were closer to Australia work with me as a group, and ones who were closer to the UK work with Noor as another group.
Right.
So we had very interesting collaborations across different countries. And part of what we did was to work with the teachers so that they would do the research, but also we were doing research on the viability of a model like that for action research amongst teachers located in different places. And what we found was that the teachers really, really valued the opportunity to correspond, to communicate and collaborate with teachers who were actually in very, very different countries. And they often found that they could share their ideas, that the issues they were facing with technology were similar. They could talk to each other about different tasks that they could do in the classroom, give each other ideas. It seemed to have been a pretty positive experience. Having said that, there were also some challenges with the use of technology, because we had to try to work out how to get everyone together, and we actually ended up using Skype. I'm not sure whether that was the very best way, but the teachers came together for 3 workshops, each separated by 2 months, and Skype was at least one platform where we could get everybody, communicating at the same time. It was a little bit unstable in some places, but it seemed to work out okay in other contexts. And we managed to get people together, so they really enjoyed that.
And what kind of how did the sense of collaboration across borders kind of influence the participants? Was there any kind of meaningful reflection that came out of it as a result?
Yeah, I think quite a few of them noted when they gave us some response to this that was a part of the experience that they hadn't expected to benefit from as much as they did, because they were working in different parts of the world, and I guess they had assumed that maybe the issues that they were dealing with would be different in different places, but in fact they found a lot of commonalities. And they also liked the ability to, or the fact that they could sort of make friends across the internet. So they felt that they could really share with each other, get a lot of quite meaningful professional development. It's very personalized, and they had other people listening to their personal issues and ideas from the classroom. So I think they commented quite substantially that they really felt that was a real benefit.
Right. And one of the outcomes of maybe sticking with that point actually, in a couple of your books that I was reading, you have a very long list of acknowledgements. And would you say that this reflects your own ethos of international networking and collaboration? I was kind of amazed at the amount of people that were mentioned. And
inside the books, you mean?
Inside the book,
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I've been really, really fortunate, because I've had several groups of I've worked with several groups of teachers across the years, for nearly 20 years actually, or more. With action research groups, and some of those teachers have gone overseas themselves and kept in touch. And I've also had quite a lot of international PhD and master students, so I've been able to to draw on a lot of their experience and their expertise in doing this kind of practitioner action research work. So I think it really has a lot of meaning for teachers internationally to share their ideas, because we often find that actually, the issues or the problems or challenges that we face in classrooms are not that different in different contexts. People are still interested in, what do you do about teaching grammar? What's the balance of form and function? How do we go about teaching different skills? How do we use technology in the classroom? Many of the issues are the same for many different teachers. So, yeah.
And I guess one of the end results of doing action research is getting your work out there, presenting it, publishing it, or maybe just doing it just for yourself. What I want to ask about first is firstly, what's an effective way to get your work out there? And also, if you are a person reading that work, what's the best way to take something meaningful from that work?
Okay, well, let's do the how do you get it out there first.
Start with that one first.
Yeah. So how to get it out there? I have to say that with nearly all the teachers I've worked with, one of the aspects of working together has been that they will somehow write up the research.
Okay.
Because I have a pretty strong personal perspective that we need more teacher research out there, because I think there's not enough that's been done by teachers, which other teachers can draw from. So I've been fortunate that all the groups of teachers I've worked with over the years have usually ended up writing about their research, and we talk about that in workshops and how to go about writing it, and the fact that the audience is other teachers and it's not an academic paper, but it's the story of the research that other teachers can benefit from or can look at or relate to, I guess. So that's really quite a good starting point, I think. I'm lucky because a lot of the teachers I work with get the opportunity to present their research. So if possible, I try and build in presentation time.
Right.
And I'm working with groups of teachers every year in Australia now who are teaching the international students who come to the country. And we've been lucky because we've got some funding from Cambridge English to do that program. We're very grateful for that because it means that teachers can, come and work with me and go through whole cycles of action research. And at the end of that, they get to present their research at a conference, which is held every year in Australia. So that's another way that they can really publicise their research. Most of the teachers I worked with have wanted to publish their research, or at least to publicise it. And I think that I would also say that not every teacher who does action research necessarily has to publish the research, but it's rather a loss if the research is somehow not disseminated to other teachers.
Yes.
So it could be through a presentation or a short newsletter or short blog or something where you're sharing your ideas. And I think the second part of your question was what can teachers take?
How can you effectively read or listen to or talk about someone's research and take something from it? Because a lot of the time, that's, for me personally, that's the hardest thing, is actually reading someone's research critically and thinking about how it could apply to my setting, for example. Yes.
Well, there's no doubt that you can't generalise from action research because it's very contextualised. It's done in a specific location with specific circumstances surrounding that location. But I do think that the sort of narrative of the research is often, other teachers will say, well, that looks kind of similar to my situation. And maybe if I tried these activities in my classroom, because after all, action research focuses on practical ideas and activities that other teachers can maybe share or use. So I think it's more kind of research that sort of resonates for other teachers and gives illustrations about what they could perhaps do differently or think about differently for themselves. Is that the kind of thing that you were thinking about?
That's right. And I guess one of the pitfalls of when you do maybe go through and publish something is research tends to get overgeneralized.
Yes.
And when we spoke to Thomas Farrell, he kind of said the same thing, that often very practical-based, reflective research can somehow be transformed to the wider spectrum of teaching contexts, and there's kind of a problem with that.
Yeah, well, I don't think you can generalize particular studies, as I said before, because they're specific to that location.
Yeah.
But you can. They are illustrative, even if they're not generalizable. They can show examples or cases, if you like, to other teachers about what could be done in similar circumstances, or to address similar interests or similar issues that you think are important, to explore more in the classroom. So, no, I don't think it's generalizable, and I don't think action researchers should claim generalizability from their research. But I do think that after you build up a certain number of cases where people are perhaps working on a similar issue, there is something to say about messages that they hold for other teachers elsewhere.
Okay, and perhaps in your 1999 book, you talk about the orientations of AR. For example, you talked about the aims, the contributions are usually overlapping and varied. I wonder if you could sort of unpack what AR's orientations are.
Right. Well, I think the main thing the main orientation of AR is really to improve our own social circumstances in a way.
Okay.
To look for things that work positively for ourselves and our students. So a lot of AR, I think, starts from gaps or something that we feel intuitively or consciously or unconsciously is sort of missing in our classroom, or something that makes us uncomfortable or disturbs us, or we don't feel is quite right. So I think that action research has that kind of starting off point, and hopefully the end point is that you learn a lot more about the messages and the understandings that perhaps you understood only rather superficially when you began the research.
I see.
What's really interested me about a lot of the teachers I work with is that they often say they get a number of things out of doing the research as far as their practice is concerned, and almost the number one thing is that they understand their students a lot better.
Yeah.
So it seems to be a process where teachers begin to really go under the surface of what's obvious in the classroom, to really identify much more closely with the students and how they're learning and what their needs are, and perhaps where they can take those students. And often they're quite surprised at the capacity of the student to inform the teacher and to work with the teacher to really create a more effective way of operating. So that seems to be a big thing for a lot of teachers, that they understand, they get to understand their students in a much deeper way, and the students can become quite excited about trying new things in combination with the teacher.
Okay, so one of the themes of our podcast when we speak to researchers is there always seems to be somewhat of a disconnect between the teacher doing research in the classroom and maybe the more scholarly research articles out there. And a lot of the researchers we speak to say that they're trying to bridge that gap. But action research itself you mentioned it holds quite a fragile status and is somewhat undervalued in the field of ELT research. Why do you think this is, and do you think it's still the case now?
Well, I think in the past that there has been a lot of research in the field which has been done from a more experimental or quantitative perspective, and perhaps that kind of research has been seen as more scientific or more rigorous or reliable or valid, perhaps. But we've seen some changes, I think, in our field over recent decades, and certainly, qualitative research has become much more prevalent. people are doing much more in the area of case studies or ethnography, and using much more qualitative designs than perhaps we did when we were first beginning to do research in the ELT field. Action research is probably the newest comer, if you like, to the research scene, and it's become, I mean, if you go back 2 or 3 decades, people barely mentioned action research, and when they did, it was often seen as not rigorous enough or not scientific enough. But I think that that's changing, because the whole idea of what kind of teacher education and professional development is appropriate for teachers has changed as well.
Right.
And the view now is that teachers need to be very actively engaged in their own professional development, and therefore there needs to be some kind of sense of agency in their classrooms where they can work on more substantial sort of issues. And action research, I think, is part of that process. So increasingly in the literature, I'm now seeing support for action research, whereas 2 or 3 decades ago, probably that support was patchy, should we say, rather than substantial. But there have been a number of books that have been published. One which was published in the early 2001, actually, by TESOL International, edited by Julian Edge, where there were a number of case studies which put action research on the map. And then Keith Richards, in a book on qualitative research, talks about action research being a powerful form of research for teachers. And then more recently, there have been other people talking about, the sort of coming of age of action research, which I think is very interesting, because I was quite surprised when I read that and hadn't seen that kind of comment before. So I think there's there's greater openness now than there was to action research, say, 2 or 3 decades ago. I guess action research still suffers from a number of criticisms, one of which is it's not generalizable. The other is the subjectivity of how a person can be an actor in the research site and also a researcher at the same time, which means that you have to be very skilled at not being influenced by your own subjectivity, and so these kinds of criticisms are quite common, I think, against action research.
Right. Okay, so some teaching institutions, I imagine, don't do a lot of action research, and perhaps they simply focus on not simply, but they focus more on the teaching, the students. A lot of them are very financially orientated, like private schools, for example. How would you go about trying to instill more action research in these kind of institutions where perhaps they're not actively doing it?
Yeah, well, I think I'd start off by saying I don't think that action research should be forced on teachers at all. I think that teachers should have a range of good professional development opportunities, including sort of sharing their practices or discussion circles or reading circles. I mean, I think there are lots of much more active ways now to introduce professional development rather than the sort of top-down type of presentation, which doesn't necessarily help teachers all that much in the long run. But I do think that action research should be a choice for teachers, and the places where I've seen it work best is when teachers have volunteered to do action research. It's really quite interesting because I've been conducting some research with a PhD student of mine, Emily Edwards, who was a teacher in one of my action research programs in Australia. And Emily has been looking at what makes a difference to teachers being able to do research. And there's no doubt that institutional support and recognition is what is necessary as a basis if action research is going to work effectively. So it's very hard for teachers to just do action research in a context where there isn't much support for them to do it. So it seems to work best where the management and where the institution is supportive of teachers having some time and some space to do that kind of work, and also recognizing the efforts that the teachers go to and giving them opportunities to, share their ideas, or maybe even using the results of their research for further curriculum development. So what's come out of the research that Emily and I have done is that it's really clear that makes a big difference when teachers want to do action research. And the other example I could give is at one of the institutions in Sydney, where some of the teachers had been part of the action research program in Australia that I've been conducting for the last 7 years. Some of them worked very constructively with their director of studies, who saw the value in the research that they'd been doing, and decided to create a group or to create opportunities for other teachers within that institution to start doing action research as well. And that's been extremely successful. And teachers who had only just sort of vaguely heard about it became quite excited about the idea of combining with their colleagues who'd been through the process, and they've now got a continuing cycle that goes on every year. Continuing programs that go on every year, where the teachers get the opportunity to do action research as part of their professional development program. Right. So yes, I'm total agreement with you that it needs to be or it's works very productively where managers can see the value of it and will give teachers time to do it.
Yeah, I guess one of the conflicts is when it's, like you said, top down, and perhaps you're going to be observed on your teaching and asked to reflect, as opposed to coming from the teacher.
Well, the whole ethos or philosophy of action research is that it really should come out of your own ideas about how to, as I said, make the situation the best it possibly can be. So if it's imposed from the top, it's coming from a very different direction than if it's coming from teachers' interests and values themselves.
Yeah. And one of the things that I currently work on a program where we teach speaking skills, particularly fluency skills, around the theme of discussion, developing learners' discussion skills. And a lot of my fellow colleagues are involved in conducting classroom action research into speaking. And this is another area of yours that you're interested in, is teaching speaking.
Yes.
You made the distinction between getting learners doing speaking as opposed to actually teaching speaking. What is that? What are the differences between the two?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it comes out of a book that I wrote with Christine Go a few years ago on teaching speaking. And what we suggested in that book is that classrooms are often very full of speaking activities, but it's not so clearly the case that different features or aspects or components of speaking are actually being specifically addressed by the activities. So what we did was to identify different areas of speaking which we felt could be actively taught, such as genres of speaking, or discourse features, or pronunciation, or the use of cognitive strategies and metacognitive strategies like planning for speaking. So what we advocate in that book is that teachers should be focusing on these specific components and looking at how the activities that they use in the classroom are specifically addressing students' need, and also giving them feedback on their performance so that they can identify their progress and look at where their speaking skills could develop further. So I think that was a sort of basic distinction between those two things.
And was some of that informed by your own action research?
Well, actually, it's almost like one of the starting points for me with action research, because many years ago I was involved in an action research program with teachers in Australia where we recorded some samples of natural speech and looked at how we could use what we learned about natural spoken speech to inform classroom practice. It was a very interesting project because the teachers recorded quite a number of different samples from different contexts. Some were sort of transactional speech, like making appointments at the doctor or getting information over the phone or something like that, or making inquiries about something. And others were really conversational interactions where you're having casual conversation with friends, and then with the teachers, and all of us analysed particular features that we felt our students needed help with, and used those to develop activities in the classroom. So that was kind of an area that got me started, or that I got interested in through action research as well.
Right, so it seems like we've come full circle.
Yeah, full circle. Absolutely.
So maybe just to end today's interview, could you recommend some sources for our listeners if they want to find out more about action research? And what would you recommend doing if somebody wants to say, I want to go and do some action research? Yes.
Well, I think a lot of teachers get interested and inspired to do action research by hearing about what other teachers have done. So one of the good things about the research I've been doing with they have to acknowledge Cambridge English here because they supplied sponsorship for this program. They kindly offered publication for the teachers' research. So there are lots and lots of examples of teachers' action research from Australia, which can be found by going to the Cambridge English website and typing in research notes. And in the research notes, there are 6 or 7 sets of articles, all written by teachers in Australia, which give good illustrations of the kind of practical ideas people could use. I've also just recently published with my colleague from the UK the British Council report that I was telling you about, the project that I told you about earlier. And so people can find that by going to the British Council website and putting in its ELTRA projects and looking for the report which came out about a month or 2 ago.
Right. Okay.
I can send you more.
Yeah, perhaps we'll provide a link to that.
I can send you the specific links to these things if it would help.
Okay.
I guess, the book I wrote in 2010, Doing Action Research, that was written very much with teachers in mind, and very much for teachers who really just wanted to get started in action research. And as you say, it provides lots of examples and voices from teachers all over the place who did this kind of work in their classroom. So that's another source if people want to know what the steps and processes are.
Right, okay. Great, okay, well, thanks a lot, Anne, for speaking to me today.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for inviting me.
We would like to thank Anne Burns once again for her time. If you would like to find out more about Professor Anne Burns, please see the link to her website, which is in the description to this podcast. If you would like to get in touch with us, please send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @TEFLology, like our Facebook page, which is the TEFLology Podcast on Facebook, and we also have a website, which is TEFLology-podcast.com. Thank you for listening to this episode, and we'll be back with a regular episode soon.